you all for being here. And also thank you so much, Helga, because coming after, I feel like I can actually play off what you said a little bit and focus on some of the other infrastructures that have been destroyed and degraded in Gaza, and also to put this in a little broader context by thinking about the construction of hunger as a political act and as an atrocity in Gaza, and then also thinking a little bit about Yemen, even though, of course, they're incredibly different places with different populations and different geographies. But I think the construction of acute hunger has actually been a common feature of a round of conflicts and sort of endemic at this point to thinking about these conflicts. So I'm going to focus more on the sort of systems that provide water, energy, food, and health, which are, of course, related integrally to the crisis in housing and what we might think of as the crime of domicide, which is now being talked about in international law as sort of a new war crime. So just to kind of frame it a little bit, I'm going to draw a lot on Alex de Waal's work, who has looked at mass atrocities of creating famine or acute hunger as political acts, right? So when we look historically, there are contributions from natural factors, but mostly we see the choice to impose forms of hunger. And I started thinking about this some years back when I actually was thinking about India in the colonial period, but more recently when I was working on Yemen. And so I think it's worth thinking about the definition of mass starvation as put forward by de Waal and his colleagues. Mass starvation as a process of deprivation that occurs when actors impede the capacity of targeted persons to access the means of sustaining life. And the important part about that sort of articulation to me is this notion that it's a process of deprivation. And so the systems that I'm going to discuss in a minute for identifying acute hunger and pushing towards definitions of famine rely on this sense that you don't wait until people have starved to death. You actually identify the political choices and actions that are driving people to the deprivation of food and life. And when we were working on Yemen with my co-author, Erica Weinthal, we did a series of interviews with international humanitarian organizations and also local providers who were specifically focused on hunger and nutrition. And one of the officials who was very disillusioned after she had served 4 years in Yemen, she said, there's so much destruction. Much of the infrastructure in Yemen is inoperable. Basic systems that underpin human rights have been rendered non-functional. And by this, she meant that she and her colleagues had been making a concerted push within organizations like the World Food Program to talk about the deprivation of food as a fundamental human right. And what would that mean in international law? I'm going to skip the relief coordinator, but he was basically saying it's a political choice to create mass starvation. So if we look at typologies that some political scientists, including de Waal, have identified for what are the purposes, the political purposes of creating acute hunger or famine, they have sort of different criteria, and I've laid some of them out. The first would be extermination or genocide. The second, control through weakening a population. The third, gaining territorial control. Flushing out a population as number 4. 5, a form of collective punishment. 6, material extraction or theft. 7, extreme exploitation. 8, war provisioning. And 9, comprehensive social transformation, which would, of course, be sort of the man-made famines that followed, say, the communist revolutions in China or Russia. But if we look at the current situation in Gaza, de Waal and other experts would conclude that there are several of these criteria that have already been met. And so I highlighted them for you here. This was, of course, as Helga just said, these are moving targets. So what was true a month ago will not be true in a month, right? If things continue as they are, they will be actually rapidly worse. But as of early December, both the sort of international organizations who are delivering food aid into Gaza and outside experts said, look, it's obvious that several of these purposes are already being fulfilled, and there is a general case that is starting to be made that it's evident what will happen, right? So the responsibility to now basically reconfigure how we think about these things is already well underway. So I wanted to yes.
Jeannie, excuse me. Could you enlarge your could you make your PowerPoint full screen? Is that
I'm
so
possible? Sorry. Yes,
no
absolutely.
Problem.
Yes. Let me just do that. Sorry. that better?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I was just going to say, so I wanted to share some of the findings of the Famine Review Committee. And as many of you will know, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification is an early warning system that's set up by a consortium of UN agencies and other organizations working on humanitarian aid to essentially alert the international community when things are reaching different types of thresholds that are defined in fairly complicated ways. But what's striking about the findings of this particular review that was just released in late December is how quickly almost everyone in Gaza is facing acute food insecurity. And so, as Helga pointed out, and as those of us who have studied Gaza for many years know, this is building on the kinds of precariousness and inadequacies of the existing situation before October, but also this cycle that we've seen of periods of acute conflict with extensive urban destruction of infrastructure and also housing and also food systems writ large. So the consequences of this quote unquote ongoing catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity at the same time as the food system, health system, these are the water, sanitation, and hygiene systems, and broader social systems, should be viewed by decision makers as completely unacceptable. So just to quickly, I wanted to share some of the findings that they have found. Helga already talked about the sort of bombing of buildings extensively in neighborhoods and streets, but I wanted to focus on the other types of infrastructure. So one source of hunger is that commercial agriculture has been completely stopped, and this is always due to the lack of water and energy provision, but also food processing facilities have been destroyed. And as in almost all cases of acute hunger, it's the inability of those people who are hungry to have the resources and the entitlements to command the food that they need. And so that is obviously seen in the cases of where food access is restricted, but it's most quickly seen in rising prices that drive out many people from being even able to obtain foodstuffs were they available. By all available accounts, they're actually not widely available in Gaza, and what is available, the price increases have been extremely rapid. So you can see that compared to last September, flour is now 50% more expensive, vegetables 200% more expensive, rice 45% more expensive, and most importantly, fuel, which underpins the provision of water and sanitation and food more generally, has increased by 500%. The basic problems of even taking grain is if it's available and milling it into flour and then producing it in bakeries is now no longer possible because most of the bakeries have been destroyed and most of the mills and the bakeries, even that international organizations rely upon within the Strip, have also been targeted. The same is true for healthcare, as you all know, having read the news, and the same is true for UNRWA health centers. Only 8 out of 22 are operating at the moment. But if we look at the underpinning environmental infrastructures that mediate between civilian life and the provision of basic essentials, or in international law, objects that are considered essential for civilian life, only 35% of the fuel that would be needed to operate the existing WASH infrastructure is available. There are cross-water pipelines running from Israel to Gaza, but they are being held at a smaller percentage. A few weeks ago, at only 28% capacity, and the cross-border pipeline that supplied North Gaza has been closed completely. There are 3 major desalination plants that supplement groundwater and pipelines, as well as wells, and those are only operating at 4% capacity, mostly because of the lack of energy and fuel. The Gaza municipality, of course, reports that sewage outflows are flooding the streets and the Mediterranean, which, by the way, has happened in every round of conflict between Israel and Gaza. Municipal wells are no longer functioning, again, because of the lack of fuel, and there's no solid waste collection, which, of course, is basically creating a huge amount of health impacts. So to put this in a broader comparative and longer term perspective, I just wanted to talk about some of the work that I did with Erica Weinthal in a project the last couple of years about looking at the targeting of civilian infrastructures, specifically water, energy, and food in Gaza and in Yemen. And I want to sort of highlight some of the continuities as well as the departures that we see in the current conflict. We built a database that builds on existing data sets. We also did our own open searches. We also looked for documents that would talk more about compounding interactive and cumulative effects, which are not captured in sort of incidents that are reported. And then we also did fieldwork and interviews where we could get, and I should reinforce Helga's point, that the inaccessibility of Gaza has been a long-standing problem. I have not been in Gaza since the first Intifada, when I actually spent a great deal of time there, but I have not been able to go back since. So it makes my understanding of Gaza much more limited than, say, in the West Bank or in places that have been more accessible to outside researchers. So the data set that we compiled, it has an arbitrary starting point right before the second Intifada, running up through 2017 when we stopped data collection. So I don't even know how you would possibly try to collect data from this war. It has been so fast and so comprehensive, and the scale has been so great that it's no longer even a project that I think would be worth undertaking in the sense that it's just been so comprehensive. But what we can see is that there were many sort of preludes, if you like, and each one sort of scaled up in intensity in terms of targeting water, energy, agriculture, and health in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And if we look at the Gaza Strip in particular, we coded 297 incidents of deliberate targeting of infrastructure in that time period. And you can see that most of that was in agriculture, and by that we included land, markets, transportation of food, and those kinds of things. But a good chunk of that, 43%, already targeted the water infrastructure. And although a much smaller percentage targeted energy, it's important to note that because there was really only one power plant, attacks on one power plant obviously had significant and reverberating effects elsewhere. And to sort of re-emphasize Helga's point that Gaza is not somehow, it's the most extreme example of sort of dispossession of the Palestinians as a collective, but the project, if you like, of dispossession and expropriation through the targeting of agriculture in particular and water systems has been a prevalent feature of violence in the West Bank, of infrastructural violence particularly. And so when we collected data for the West Bank, again, relying very heavily on, in this case, UN OSHA reporting, 516 of those incidents targeted agriculture, and 140 targeted water, and 29% again targeted energy. And in those instances, it was also the energy systems were often renewable energy systems, such as solar panels that had been provided by donors. And so for the West Bank, as in Gaza, I think Helga's question, and a question that many of us have asked over the years, is what is happening with the sort of project of building infrastructure when you know in advance that the infrastructure will be degraded, destroyed, or taken out? And this is a question we asked humanitarian organizations over and over and over. And their answer was often quite technical, that they would pre-position materials, they would pre-position things like wastewater treatment water treatment chemicals such as chlorine, and other provisioning sort of inside, in this case, inside the Gaza Strip in anticipation of the next round of conflict. But those sort of technical answers didn't really answer this question of accepting the parameters of building and rebuilding and destroying, as sort of Helga highlighted. And we highlighted this in our work as well, because in a sense, it actually makes no sense, right? It accepts the parameters of the conflicts as they are, rather than sort of stepping back and trying to find a more comprehensive way of dealing with this. So when we look at Yemen, this was at the height of 2021, we'll see, of course, many, many more people because Yemen's population is so great, but actually there was much more variation across Yemen in the degree of acute food insecurity than we see in Gaza, where actually the entire population has been declared at crisis or above, and the vast majority are now in what is called people in emergency. So people who are able to only eat about one meal a day, they have inadequate calorie intake, and they cannot access food. And so here we see a similar pattern in Yemen, where agriculture was actually one of the most targeted sectors by infrastructure, during the Yemen conflict. We only collected data till 2019. And here, most of these targets were done by the Saudi campaign. The sort of intensity of the air campaign was when we saw very, very high rates of targeting agriculture and fishing infrastructures. And we see that in the case of Yemen, this clustered around cities in particular, but also ports. So Al Hudaida was a site of many, many targets on infrastructure, as well as particularly in northern Yemen, where the Houthis had a stronghold. So I'm going to I want to move to just an explicit comparison, and then I'll stop because I want to hear the conversation. We have extraordinary people listening in, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. But it's just worth pointing out that interstate civil conflict is not imposing the same level of destruction on civilian infrastructure as when we have powerful state actors engaged in aerial bombardment. So in Gaza and in Yemen, with the highest rates of civilian destruction are this kind of both intentional and unintentional damage from sustained campaigns from the air. So aerial destruction has become sort of means, if you like, of reducing the livelihoods of the population. So I just want to explicitly highlight a few of the parallels that I see, and then maybe talk about a few of the differences in the Q&A. So the first thing is that this assumption that the majority of populations in Yemen and Gaza are reliant on humanitarian aid is the fundamental problematic. So what has happened in these conflicts such that this expectation is kind of acceptable? Sorry, I have a cold, so let me just take a quick sip of water. So the fact that high levels of dependency is now a structural feature is I think, an important starting point, because that is where we can ask about the destruction and reconstruction of infrastructure, which is that right now, most of it depends on humanitarian aid, and the acceptance that that is a sort of a framework, if you like, is this reflection of de-development, right? So that is an outcome of de-development in both cases. The other problems that we see in both are that many of the largest international aid donors are either direct parties to the conflict, in the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or in the case of the US in the Gaza war, are direct partners in the campaigns. And the structural fact that the aid can never be enough to meet the needs of the population imposes all sorts of forms of rationing. And these forms of rationing are highly intrusive. So when we were doing our interviews with more local organizations, they reported that whether it was in Yemen or in Syria and Libya, the imposition of things like biometric forms of registration and monitoring are highly intrusive, and actually that data breaches have occurred, and that kind of information is not secure. And so that populations in these areas are rightfully suspicious of when highly digitized forms of information are collected as part of humanitarian aid. The other sort of huge similarity that I see is that the imposition of blockades on commercial providing of goods is what is driving acute hunger in both cases. And as Helga mentioned, the Gaza reconstruction mechanism is well known for imposing this form of rationing and imposing incredibly difficult bureaucratic delays that delay reconstruction. But again, the question of how did that reconstruction mechanism get accepted to be not just temporary, but now long-term, is the fundamental political problem. And the same with Yemen. The UN monitoring systems, whether they were set up for Gaza or for Yemen, became tools of bigger political projects that really had enormous costs in terms of human well-being and especially food security. I think that the diversions and obstructions of aid by parties to the conflict have been well documented for some parties more than others. So there was significant international attention to the Houthis doing so in Yemen, but there was much less to the ways that the international mechanisms themselves also obstruct aid. And then the last feature that we have seen in all cases is that the notion that by providing coordinates of civilian infrastructure to belligerents, to the party or to the parties of the conflict, will actually reduce civilian targeting is not accurate. So both in the case of Yemen and Gaza, It is known where those water treatment plants are. It is known where the sewage treatment plants are. It's known where the power plants are. And in both cases, they've been subjected to repeated attacks in also short sequences, right? So you cannot argue that this is a form of collateral damage or unintentional targeting. So these targets are known, they are listed, and they are coordinated. And many humanitarian organizations are now reluctant to continue providing coordinates for their facilities because they feel that there has been no respect for that kind of neutrality. So I should stop in just 1 minute, but I just want to emphasize just a couple of the sort of cumulative and interactive effects. And I think Helga did this so well for talking about houses. And I just want to focus a little bit on what it means for the environment more broadly or the provision of food more broadly. So I'm just going to start with the loss of livelihoods. The collapse of water and sanitation system actually contaminates both groundwater and agricultural soils. So it is not the case that you can simply restore agricultural land to its prior situation. And we see that also in the outright destruction of agricultural land in these conflicts. So both directly from the actions of tanks and other sorts of vehicles compacting what are actually quite fragile soils, and the creation of things like buffer zones, whether it's on the Egyptian side, where actually, you sort of uniformly, you rather arbitrarily create buffer zones by the Egyptian state, whether it's in North Gaza, where you have, again, the sort of military incursion actually destroying arable land, or the imposition of military zones elsewhere. And then the last point that I'll just quickly make is that all of these things are undermining resilience and opening up vulnerability to sort of objective forms of, say, climate change, flooding, and drought, right? So at the very time where we need more resilient infrastructure and a resolution to these conflicts in order to provide that, we're trapped in situations in which it's acceptable that acute hunger is going to persist. And as I started with, that hunger is politically created by the lack of resolution to these conflicts.